Hello, this is Mrs. Polisky, and here are your notes for Module 8. We're going to talk about the senses of taste, smell, and touch. And so we're going to start with the sense of taste. Sense of taste is a chemical sense. It has a tendency to work with smell. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. But it's known as gestation. And there are 4 qualities of taste: sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. There's also a possible 5th known as umami. This is kind of a flavor that you find in Asian foods. Taste receptors. These are taste buds. They are found on the top and sides of the tongue, and they're clustered together in something called papilla. When we talk about our sense of taste, we have different areas of the tongue that are sensitive to certain sensations of taste. As you can see, our papilla is kind of found throughout the tongue itself, sides, and also towards the front and top. When we talk about the sensation of taste, certain papilla or taste buds are a little more sensitive to certain types of taste. So for example, the sensation of sweet has a tendency to be kind of clustered near the front of the tongue, a little bit towards the middle. Salty has a tendency to be kind of located near the very tip of the tongue. Bitter, a little bit in the front, but also a very large cluster towards the back of the tongue. And sour is clustered primarily on the sides. And if you take a look at the papilla, up at the very top, there are these little hair follicles. This helps grab onto the food and helps us be able to taste our food a little bit better and for us to sense our food. Okay, this is also a little bit about why our dentist always wants us to brush our tongue, so that way we don't leave food particles behind on that. All right, there are people who are known as super tasters that, for the most part, have a very high abundance of taste receptors, and especially when we talk about the sensation of bitter. Okay, they're very sensitive to that. This would be great if you were a food taster, perhaps maybe for a king from the past, so that way you could detect any poisonous substances within food. One thing to remember is that if you happen to eat foods that are very, very hot, it's possible to burn your taste receptors. The good thing is many of our taste receptors can be regenerated, and hence we will be able to taste again. There is a very small section of our population that are what we call non-tasters. They do not taste, okay, or they have a much smaller intensity of the sensations of taste. Most of us fall kind of into the middle. We're kind of medium tasters, all right? Moving onward. The sense of smell. Again, this is a chemical sense. It also works in conjunction with our taste senses. Molecules given off by many substances circulate in the air, and we breathe those in. Inside of our nasal cavity, it's very humid and moist, and our nasal cavity is lined with lots of little receptor cells that we're going to talk a little bit about here in a moment. Our ability to process those smells is contained within the olfactory bulb. Okay, the olfactory bulb literally is lying kind of at the base of the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, unlike taste cells, your olfactory cells do not regenerate when they're damaged. And as we get older, they have a tendency to decrease. So many elderly individuals do have a noticeable decrease of the sense of smell. Okay, smell and taste do work together, and it's possible that if you have a cold, smells that might travel up the back of your throat will not make it, and what will end up happening is food just won't taste very good. Partially because you can't smell it, but you can't taste it. So, yeah, it's kind of a bummer when you have a cold. All right, our sense of smell, olfaction. It is a biochemical chain of events. There is something called odorant binding protein. Okay, this is associated with specialized hairs in the nose. We kind of call odorant binding protein by this acronym, the OBP. If you want to write that out, go ahead and do so. But it's that odorant binding protein which stimulate the olfactory bulb. It has an intimate connection with our memory. And that, it kind of works really well because if you look at the olfactory bulb, it's not very far from our limbic system. Okay, so there's a tendency that we can relate certain memories with certain smells. So, like, I think we can all conjure up the smell of cut grass. And it might make you think of Mr. Ween mowing the lawn here at school. Or perhaps maybe the smell of the locker room or something of that nature. It will conjure up a memory, good or bad. Okay? Animals use the sense of smell to communicate. There's something called pheromones. It's a chemical signal released by organisms to communicate with other members of its species. That's the reason why some animals have a tendency to mark their territory. Okay, when we talk about this odorant binding protein, okay, there are these little hair cells that are kind of located along the nasal passage or the nasal cavity. Okay, these little hair cells are tied into the nervous system, and there is an olfactory nerve that's kind of connecting to the olfactory bulb. So when we inhale, let's say the smell of a rose, that travels through our nasal cavity, and it kind of collects, thanks to the humidity that's inside of our nasal cavity, on these little hair follicles. That stimulates the nerve and it travels to the olfactory bulb. Okay, when we talk about that sense of smell, we have an ability to distinguish 10,000 different smells in our environment. And compared to taste, our sense of smell is also 10,000 times greater, okay, than our sense of taste. So just a few molecules of a real putrid smell, like rotting cabbage or rotten eggs, will trigger this, and we'll kind of be able to identify those items. When we talk about the differences between males and females, we'll go to this slide here. Um, Women have a tendency to have a better sense of smell than men. As you get through your teen years and into your adulthood, you're going to kind of be at the peak of your ability to smell. But as we kind of enter our 40s and onward, both men and women have a subtle decline in their sensitivity to certain smells. Individuals who have lost all sense of smell have anosmia, which is really kind of a sad thing. There's some stats here. About 90% of all people can identify the smell of coffee. About 80% of all people can identify the smell of leather. About 70% of all people can identify the smell of bubble gum. About 50% of the people can identify the smells of honey and vanilla. Okay? They say that women, especially women who have given childbirth, have the ability to identify their child just by smell alone a few hours after birth. And it's also kind of a vice versa. Babies have that ability to identify who their mother is based on the sensitivity to smell. All right. And when we talk about the processing areas in the brain for smell and taste, um, processing center for the sense of smell, it's kind of in that olfactory bulb, kind of at the base of the brain. Some people say it's a little bit towards the back of the frontal lobe, maybe the beginning of the temporal lobe. Our processing centers for taste are definitively within the temporal lobe of the brain. All right, our skin senses. There are some basic different senses to skin, but let's talk a little bit about why we have skin. It protects us. It protects us against injury, it holds in our fluids, and it helps us regulate our body temperature. We are 10 times more accurate in sensing stimulation on our fingertips than stimulation on our back. So there obviously are more sense receptors for touch on those fingertips. Okay, when we talk about the sense of taste or sense of touch, um, pain is probably the predominant one. Warmth, cold, and pressure are all part of that. But pain itself can dominate over all other senses if we're experiencing that. All right. There is something called the gate control theory. This was developed or proposed by a guy named Ronald Milzak and another fellow named Patrick Wall. What this theory basically says is that the pain messages um, from the body, typo there, travel from one set of nerve fibers in the spinal cord to other kinds of sensory information that travel on other sets of fibers. Um, Under some condition, non-pain fibers can close pain gates, and this is why other touch sensations can particularly block the sensation of pain. And in your book, they have a little diagram. So if you would, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you do this just by itself to the warm water, but if you could grab the pipes for both the warm and the hot water, there's a tendency um, for those to kind of block one another. If you grab the cold water, obviously you're going to feel the cold, you're going to feel the hot, but when you grab both, they have a tendency to block out. As a result, um, you can grab both of them and you can have this eerie sensation of hot. All right. When we talk about pain um, and such, um, people react to pain differently, and some of that is because of psychological reactions. But pain, for the most part, is a warning that something is hurting us. And sometimes it's a little difficult for us to understand, especially if we talk about the health of the nerve fibers to begin with. As we touch something that might be sharp, like this tack, that signal has got to travel up the nervous system through the spinal cord to the brain. A response is going to be sent back that way to tell us to move our foot. There are some people that because of the condition of the nervous system, it might be a little harder for them to move as a result of that. All right. Dealing with pain, I mentioned before, there's some psychological issues. There are some biological issues when we talk about the spinal cord's large and small fibers. There's some genetic differences when we talk about um, endorphin production. Some people can produce a lot of endorphins and they have a very high tolerance for pain. There are some social cultural influences. If there are other people there, you may not react to pain maybe the same way as if you were alone. If people are being very empathetic towards you, you might react differently to pain. There's psychological, the attention to pain. How often are we noticing that? Learning based on experiences. So, for example, if you're scared of going to the dentist, um, you may kind of associate that with pain to begin with as part of your expectations. All right, body senses. There are kinesthetic senses. This is a system for sensing position and movement of individual body parts. This relies on receptor cells throughout your muscles and your joints. Most common disruption will happen when your foot falls asleep. So if you're sitting in class and you notice that your leg is, falling asleep, um, perhaps you've had that leg in that same position for too long, so long that the nerve temporarily stops transmitting information. Okay, the vestibular sense. This is the system for sensing body orientation and balance. This is located in the semicircular canals of our inner ear. And it's easy, the easiest way to disrupt your vestibular sense is to spin in circles until you become dizzy. Okay? Um, the semicircular canals are fluid filled and they're kind of perched near the top of the cochlea. And as a result, then, if those are kind of off kilter, you're going to feel like you're very dizzy and not feeling very good. All right. Thank you for listening.